Today, we're going to cut through all the noise around a really big Supreme Court ruling on tariffs. It's one of those stories that's been spun a dozen different ways, so our job right now is to separate what's real from what's just hype.
You've probably seen this kind of thing flying around online, right? It's just this chaotic mashup of policy news, these promises of massive refunds, and, of course, wild market predictions all jammed into one headline.
It is so easy to get lost when the headlines are screaming one thing, but the reality on the ground is way, way more complicated. So, what we're going to do is slow it all down, take a look at what actually happened, and pull the real signal out of all that noise. Let's dive in.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll break down the court's decision, then look at the government's next move, debunk that whole fantasy about refunds, figure out why the market reacted the way it did, and finally, what it all means for you. All right, first things first, let's get right to the core of it, the event that kicked this whole thing off. What did the Supreme Court actually decide? So the court, in a 6-3 decision, basically said, whoa, hold on. The main point was that if a policy is going to be this broad, run for this long, and be this expensive, Congress has to be crystal clear in authorizing it. This was a ruling about the limits of executive power, not really about the tariffs themselves. And the key here is that they zeroed in on one specific legal justification. See, the court wasn't making some big, sweeping statement on all trade policy. Nope. It was laser-focused on this one act and questioned whether it was being stretched way beyond what it was originally meant for.
And here it is. This is where the biggest misunderstanding happened. So many people heard the words struck down and just assumed it meant, poof, all tariffs are gone. But that's not it at all. Think of it like this. The court closed one on-ramp to a super busy highway. It didn't shut down the entire interstate. Other legal routes are still very much open for business.
So, what happens when one path gets blocked? Well, the story doesn't just end, right? Policymakers just start looking for a different route, and that leads us straight to the government's response. And that is exactly what happened. I mean, within minutes, literally minutes of the ruling, policymakers were already signaling their next move. The conversation immediately pivoted to using different authorities, different laws. This wasn't a retreat from tariffs. It was a total redesign of the strategy. This is such a critical point because a new policy isn't an instant replacement. Some policy tools are fast. It's like flipping a switch. But others, oh man, others are incredibly slow and complicated. We're talking months of paperwork, public hearings. It's a whole thing. And that timeline, that's a huge variable for businesses and markets. And this question right here, this is what separates a passive headline reader from an active analyst. Don't just ask if the court blocks something. You gotta ask, what's the workaround? And how fast can they get it in place? Because that's where the next market shock is gonna come from. Okay, now let's tackle the second major misunderstanding. This whole fantasy about a massive wave of refund checks just getting mailed out automatically. I mean, you can't just push a button on the government and have cash drop out. The reality is that getting a refund is a long, complicated legal and administrative process. It's a waiting game for the businesses that actually paid these duties. So let's break this down. First, you have the big, flashy headline number. This is the grand total of all the money that was collected. It sounds huge, it's impressive, but honestly, it's just the starting point. Because then, that big number starts to shrink a lot. You have to subtract everything that's not even eligible for a claim because of paperwork deadlines or how the shipments were classified or a dozen other administrative hurdles. This smaller number is the practical recoverable amount. And then, finally, you'll get down to the real-world number. This is what actually gets paid out. It's often just a tiny fraction of that original total, and it only goes to the people with the time, the patience, and the resources to navigate the whole system. So, no, it's not some instant tidal wave of cash. Okay, so if the ruling wasn't a total cancellation and the whole refund thing is mostly a fantasy, why on earth did assets like silver jump so sharply? What was going on there? Well, it's because the market wasn't reacting to a simple cause and effect. It was reacting to sustained turbulence in policy. And this turbulence creates something called an uncertainty premium. All that unpredictability, that's basically fuel for hard assets like precious metals. And this is exactly why silver's price action has been so volatile lately. It's not a nice, smooth, steady climb. It's more like a chaotic tug of war.
right? With these sharp moves up and then these nasty pullbacks, as the market desperately tries to price in constant policy surprises.
This whole policy drama doesn't happen in a bubble. It connects directly to the broader economic mood, to the pressures that real people are feeling every single day.
Just think about how it all connects. The court ruling shows there are limits on power. The policy workarounds create a whole new layer of uncertainty. Meanwhile, households are already feeling squeezed by things like rising property taxes. So when people feel like the system is rigged or constantly changing, their trust in it just erodes. And metals are a trust asset. When trust drops, demand for them often goes up.
So, with all that in our back pocket, what do you do with this information? How do you apply this to your own strategy, whether it's for your business or your investments? What's the smart move?
At the end of the day, the smartest strategy is to look right past that initial headline. The real opportunity, the real story, is in the gap between the court's ruling and when that new policy workaround gets deployed. You have to pay attention to the slow, boring, administrative process, because that's where the real story unfolds, not in some sensational media narrative.
You see, the Supreme Court's decision wasn't the end of this story. It was really just the start of a brand new, very uncertain chapter. And it leaves all of us with the critical question, what comes next? Is it a return to business as usual, or is it just another layer of turbulence that changes how markets and people behave?